linguistic terminology. The goal of this talk is to make you as familiar as I can in a talk with grammar terminology that you might hear thrown around on the Discord channel in particular and in grammar discussions, or language discussions. Maybe I should have generally said linguistic terminology. There are a few caveats before. So first of all, just like Chatna, I should say I'm not a linguist. The best I can do is child of a linguist. I didn't even study this. This is what I've gained from studying a few too many languages. The second thing is that this talk is certainly going to be too long. So I have a question to the people who are here. I can either skip a lot of the details and thereby cut it down in length, or I can offer part 2 outside of the qep'a. So if you could quickly maybe put in the chat if you'd be willing, if you'd be interested in a part 2, if you prefer to that I stick strictly to the basics, I would appreciate that. And while you are doing this, I'm going to continue saying that this is not necessary knowledge to learn Klingon. This is for more theoretical discussions of this, or really any language. It is perfectly possible to learn Klingon without knowing much of this. There are a few things you should know, but not all of this. And finally, some of the things I'm going to be telling you are controversial. Okay, I see a lot of people are willing to listen to a part 2. I have 2 more people writing, so I'll wait for that. But yeah, in the meantime, some of the things I'll be telling you are controversial. That's partially due to the fact that Mark Okrand didn't write TKD for an audience of linguists, but for a general audience. Plus, he was explicitly writing it tongue-in-cheek, so he avoids grammar terminology. And then there are really 2 schools of thought. Some people are of the opinion, okay, the whole point of linguistic terminology is to be as cross-language as possible, right? When I talk about, say, a subject, which is a word that I think most of you have heard, then the idea is that this concept applies to as many languages as possible. You know, even if I talk about a language that doesn't call it a subject. I don't know if, let's say, the Chinese language they have their own word for subject, and it's not going to be related to the Latin word subject. But we translate it as that because it is the same concept. So you can say on this basis that we are free to use Terran linguistic terminology for Klingon. But there is also the school of thought that says, no, just as we defer to Mark Okrand explicitly for telling us new words, we should also defer to him explicitly for linguistic terminology. So if he hasn't used a word for a concept, then we shouldn't be using it either. Now, what I'm going to do is, because I'm trying to be a bit complete here, I'm trying to give you some basic familiarity with all of the words you might hear in a discussion of Klingon. So I'm going to be adhering to the first school of thought, that if there is a word in a Terran language that even is comparable to what we have in Klingon, then that means we can use the word. This is my thought of it. You know, we have so many. I study, for an example, I study Middle Egyptian. That's the hieroglyphic Egyptian, the classical language. And as far as we know, the ancient Egyptians didn't describe their language. So whatever description we put on there is going to be something we put on there. We use our terminology to describe this language, but as far as we know, didn't describe itself. And I see the situation as similar for Klingon. But this is my opinion, and you're going to have to form your own. So I see people would either love a part 2 or really don't care. So I'm going to do this very detailed, and if I don't get through, I'll be putting up a poll at some point. I'll be using the recording to see who was here and ping you, and we'll try and find a date for a part 2, but the part 2 will also definitely end up on YouTube. Right, and with that, let's finally start. Welcome. The first thing we're going to talk about is phonology, which is the study of speech sounds, the sounds that we use to speak, which is most of the sounds that our mouth, nose, and throat can make. Some basic words here. We have a phoneme, which is the fancy term for speech sound. So a phoneme is a sound that is used in speech, and is particularly a sound used in the speech of a particular language. So you may hear sentences like "kl" is a phoneme in Klingon, but not in English. And with that goes right, I have an example here. So this is going to build up. So in English we have the phoneme t. Scottish Gaelic for now is the same t. So in English 2, 10, tree. In Scottish Gaelic we have te, tav, ta. Same t for now. With that goes the adjective phonemic. I see somebody asking for a copy of the slides. Yes, I can post this afterwards. So we use the word phonemic to say that one speech sound is meaningfully distinguished from another in a particular language. So if you take all the languages of the world, then all the sounds are meaningfully distinguished from another. But within one language, that distinction may not be meaningful. So the easiest example of this is dialectal speech, right? So depending on what dialect of English you speak or what accent, your R may sound different. So I learned British English in school, so I don't pronounce a lot of R's. I say water. If you're American, you'll probably say water. But I also lived in Scotland for a while, so if I imitate that accent, I might say water and roll that R sound. To go back to English and Scottish Gaelic, so in English we have the sounds T and D that are meaningfully distinguished. So to and do are two different sounds. This is a practice called voicing. So in T, your vocal cords, which you can feel here around your Adam's apple, they don't do anything. But for the D sound, they vibrate. So to, you should really, if you try and touch your Adam's apple and you say to, you should feel that the vibration only comes on for the oo sound. But if you do the same thing with do, they should vibrate the entire time. Now Scottish Gaelic does something different. So it also writes T and D, but while the T is the same as in English, so ta, which is a form of the verb to be, and but then we have what's written da is not the same distinction as in English, but instead it's so-called non-aspirated. So again, go back to English and say to, but this time put a hand in front of your mouth. To. And you should feel a pretty strong puff of air when you say that t sound. T, t, t. Which you won't feel as much when you say d. And now in Scottish Gaelic, what you actually do is you have that puff of air or you don't. So ta with the sound, with the puff of air, and ta without the puff of air, but also without the vocal cords. So this phenomenon of using the vocal cords is called voicing. So English has phonemic voicing, as in whether or not you voice a sound makes a difference in the meaning, whereas Scottish Gaelic has phonemic aspiration, because that's what this puff of air is called. So t and t, with and without the aspiration, that are different sounds. And ta, meaning, again, form of to be, and ta, meaning to, sorry, brain fart there, are two different sounds. But if you do that in English, so two and two, without the aspiration, at worst it sounds weird, but it's the same word. Right, so that is what phonemic means. Another concept here is contrast, which is again to say, the verb to say one feature is meaningfully distinguished from another. So you can say that in English, T and D contrast. So to and do are two different words. And in Scottish Gaelic, aspirated T and non-aspirated T contrast. So ta and ta are two different words. Whereas in English, to and to are not. So it's a variation. Contrast is useful insofar as you can use that for grammatical features as well. So you can say that one grammatical feature contrasts another in a language. So whereas phonemic is used only for sounds. The opposite of that is an allophone. Allophones are phonemes that are used interchangeably. So for example, that is what the aspirated T and unaspirated T are in English. And in this case, you actually do have both in English. It just depends on where in the word they are. So you see the two examples here. Top, put the hand in front of your mouth and try and say it, top. And the T, again, you're going to feel that puff of air. But now try it with stop. And you don't feel the puff of air. Because in English, after an S, a T becomes unaspirated. But if I were to say stop and actually aspirate it, you might hear it sounds a bit strange. Maybe you didn't even notice anything. Stop, stop. Don't know. You can tell me if it, native speakers tell me if it's actually noticeable. But in either case, it doesn't mean anything different. It still means the same word. Because they are allophones. They do not contrast. There's also the concept of, that is sometimes subsumed under allophones, it's so-called free variation, which is when a sound changes randomly. That's, for example, what happens in English with either, either, or neither, neither. The same speaker might use both, and it's completely random whether you choose either in any situation, and neither means anything different. Right? Right, and then finally we have the phonemic inventory. That is the list of phonemes that you get in a language. So if if you look at Klingon's list of letters, that's actually a very close match for Klingon's phonemic inventory, the list of sounds that actually exist in the language. So all of the above in both of these lists are part of the respective language's phonemic inventory. Now you may notice the way I write this here, a little more detail. This is the so-called IPA, or International Phonetic Alphabet. I'm not going to teach you that because there is only some very little logic to the IPA. It's mostly based on Latin letters. My guess is it's based on the German pronunciation of those letters because a few notable ones follow German pronunciation. But yeah, basically IPA is something you need to learn by heart. You find it marked in two ways, either with these slashes or with these square brackets. Now, sometimes you might hear people say that the problem is that these can be used for different things. But the most correct thing is that it is a contrast of the so-called phonemic and phonetic transcription. So the phonemic transcription is the abstract idea of the word, as you would pronounce it. So for example, even though most Americans say water, you probably still think of that middle sound as a T, even though you don't say T. So the phonemic transcription of water typically still uses that T. Whereas the phonetic transcription is really the reality of how you pronounce it, and it will be different for each speaker. So for an American, it will denote water. For a received pronunciation speaker, it will be water. For a Scot, it will be water, etc. And the phonetic transcription can be further subdivided into broad and narrow. So in the broad transcription, it's just that, it's broad. You're not trying to be super detailed, and you only note contrasting phonemes. Whereas the narrow one is detailed and includes something like allophones. So remember when we were talking about voicing in English? Let's go back. We have here top with the voicing versus stop without. This is a British transcription, by the way. Sorry, but as a European, that's what I learned. So this is a narrow transcription. A broad transcription would typically not bother noting this aspiration, which is what that little h means. This tells you that the T is aspirated. Whereas a broad transcription says, well, it doesn't matter anyway. If I aspirate this T or not in English, it's the same word, it still means top. So we don't bother noting this. Yeah. And broad versus narrow is a bit of a spectrum. You can be very, very narrow, super detailed. You can always find something more detailed to note. Well, nearly always. So that's a bit of a spectrum, where phonemic versus phonetic, on the other hand, is really more of a clear binary distinction. It's one or the other. And now the reason you might see both is that these slashes are often also used to mark a broad phonetic transcription. So just don't be confused when people tell you different things on what these markers of the IPA mean. Now that was all very abstract, so let's go to an example. Let's take the word pity. So the phonemic transcription is P-E-T-E, pity. This dot marks the syllable border, this apostrophe marks which syllable is stressed. But if I go to the phonetic transcription, for a broad transcription, I might also have pity, because that is the British, or the received pronunciation of it. But then I would note the American pronunciation as different, and I would say pity for the American one. And if I want to go narrow, then I add these this aspiration, because again, if you put your hand in front of your mouth and you say pity, oh, actually, this H is wrong. This is not aspirated. So forget about that, I'm sorry. Or, if you speak American, pity, you will again feel that puff of air on your hand. For another example, we have the word hamster, which phonemically is what you would expect. H, E, the vowel, M, ST, and that ending. I've gone with a more American one, but there's a few variations of this. But now, if you actually say hamster to yourself, maybe you hear it when I say it, hamster. There's a P in there that we don't write. Just far easier to pronounce it that way, and we'll get to why. So a phonetic transcription will include that P, because most speakers actually say it that way. And I'm more certain most of you do too, if you give it a try. And if you try to say it without the P, hamster, I find it actually really difficult. Okay, that's the IPA. Now some basic sounds that we distinguish. Consonant and vowel is probably something you've heard before. The technical definition is that in a consonant you have some closure of the vocal tract, so the air can't freely exit. That closure may have different levels, so in the most extreme case you actually just close off the airstream. That's what a P is. For the part of the P, your mouth is closed, no air is coming through. Whereas a vowel is a phoneme that's pronounced without any closure of the vocal tract. So the air can go freely, and the difference is made by the resonance space in your mouth. It would be nice if it were that simple, but we also have semivowels or semiconsonants, which is defined as a vowel that serves as a syllable boundary. We'll get to more details in syllables. For now, keep it in mind because it can be a useful way to describe Klingon diphthongs. So Chana mentioned this yesterday. A monophthong is when a syllable has just one vowel, which is the case in most Klingon syllables. So pak, bik, uch. All of these are monophthongs. Diphthong is when you have two vowels in one syllable. So I, a, ow. It's actually very, very common in English. English has a lot of diphthongs. In Klingon, if you want, you can distinguish diphthongs as fronting versus backing. We'll get to what that means. Fronting being the ones that end in Y, backing the ones that end in W. And now, you don't just necessarily have, or on top of having two sounds together, you can also have two letters together. That's called a monograph, where one letter equals one sound. So write the letter B, that's the sound B. Write the letter N, that's the sound N. All clear. But you can also have multigraphs, where you have several letters that make one sound. So in both English and Klingon, we have the letters C and H that taken together aren't kh or sh, but ch most of the time. So that's a digraph, right? Di, two letters to one sound. In Klingon, you also have trigraphs. TLH being, well, you have one trigraph. TLH, kl. So it's one sound, but it needs three letters to write it. Okay, right, I mentioned syllables. Basic concept of a syllable is that it is the smallest unit, phonological unit. Well, no, it's not quite the smallest. The smallest is the individual sound, but the smallest that you can meaningfully pronounce together. So here are a few syllables. Strength is an English one. Krv is, among others, a Slovak one, meaning blood. And tar, jai, and da, Klingon syllables. First of all, we have combinations of letters here. So these things are called consonant clusters, when you have several consonants together without a vowel in between. So str, ngth, and in Klingon you have rg, which is actually the only allowed consonant cluster. And here in yai we have an example of a diphthong. Parts of the syllable, we start with the onset, or also called the Anlaut. This is the German word. I'm giving you the German words in this case because they are used quite a bit in a few etymological processes, so to describe how sounds change. So if you ever feel like looking into this in more detail, then having heard the German terms may help. So in strengths we have str, in krv we have just the k, the t, the y, and the d is the onset. Then we have the nucleus or kern. That is the important part of a syllable. One thing that applies to every language where the concept of a syllable is meaningful. Should add, it's not useful for all languages. So that, how do I say? The nucleus, the really basic part of the syllable is this. And usually it's a vowel. In English and in Klingon, it has to be a vowel. So there we have the e of strength, the a of targ, the a of da, the a of jai. But there are languages where it can be consonants, which is the reason for this Slovak syllable. Just to show you, in krv, the nucleus is the r. An L can also be a nucleus in Slovak. Some other languages may have more sounds which can be that. And finally, we have the coda or Auslaut. That should have been the ngth here again. That is again typically a consonant, v, r, or a consonant cluster, or here the y, the y. But you see, da doesn't have one. So syllables that don't have a coda are called open syllables, and those that do have one are called closed syllables. Klingon allows for both, but there are languages that don't. So for example, Hawaiian doesn't have closed syllables. It just doesn't exist. Syllables are either just a vowel or a consonant plus vowel, so syllables are always open. A few more useful words are the boundary, which is both the onset and the coda, or the nucleus if there is no coda, or even can be the nucleus if there is no onset either. That is something for which Klingon doesn't really allow. So I have no example for that. And the combination of coda, of nucleus and coda is called the rhyme. This is, I mean, you can guess why. This is what in a lot of European languages we consider rhyming words. If this is essentially when the nucleus and the coda are the same. So that's why we say that top and pop rhyme. So the nucleus of O and the coda of P are the same. Whether that's important in Klingon, we can argue about. We don't really know how Klingons construct their poetry. Right, now we look into the so-called suprasegmental. Supra means above, so it means this means things that are above segments, taking segments together. The first word here is phonotactics, which is the rules on how you form syllables. So, give you an example. How do you know that the word mbabane isn't an English word? It's the capital of Eswatini, if somebody's curious. And you may have never heard this word before, but you know immediately it's not an English word. And you know that because mb at the beginning of the word just doesn't occur in English, because it goes against the rules of English phonotactics. Now, we're not going to go into detail on English phonotactics because it's complicated, but fortunately enough, the Klingon rules on how to form syllables, Klingon phonotactics, is pretty easy to summarize. With consonant and vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel, W or Y, that's how that is typically noted, apostrophe or glottal stop, and then consonant, vowel, r, which is I've mentioned before, the only allowed consonant cluster in Klingon. And the only exception to this, oh no, I don't have that here, is the suffix oi, which starts on a vowel. But the reason we have the suffix is that an actor mispronounced a word. So maybe, how do I say, we forgive it. And that's what's called phonotactics. Another thing that happens when you put syllables together into words is the stress or the accent. So you have a word stress, which is the emphasis on a syllable, or in a sentence you can have an emphasis on a word. This is called the sentence stress or the prosodic stress. So for example, let's say I told somebody, oh, I'm eating right now, and they're asking, didn't quite hear right, what are you doing? And I say, I am eating right now. This is a bit of an extreme example of prosodic stress. Most of the time, even when I'm not trying to emphasize something, there will be words that are spoken a bit higher, a bit louder, or with a bit more emphasis in a sentence. Otherwise, I'm talking like this and it's entirely robotic, and that will sound very weird. Right. And a single word, as long as it has more than 2 syllables, at least in your typical European language, one syllable is going to be spoken a bit stronger than others. Other languages have different ways of doing that. So if you've ever heard of tones in languages like Chinese or Vietnamese, that's also a form of stress or accent, where really your voice has to go up or down or move up or move down in the syllable, and otherwise it means something else. To give you an English example, we have minute, stress on the first syllable, versus minute, stress on the second syllable, and it's a completely different word, even though it's written the same way. Now, in English, usually the stress also changes how the sounds are pronounced. That's a bit of an English specialty, although other languages do that as well. Russian does this, for example. In Klingon, we often use it to distinguish affixes from a root word. So in da-tach, because I'm putting the stress on the da, that means that's my verb, and tach is a suffix. Whereas if I say da-tach, which may not actually make sense, I'm not sure, I doubt tach is transitive. But in this hypothetical example, da would be a prefix and tach is the word. So da-tach and da-tach. Somebody suggested, yes, thank you, wejmaH. Da-bej is a better example because bej is definitely transitive. So da-bej means you are certain of it, versus da-bej means he, she, it, or they certainly act like something else. So stress can be important in Klingon. Right, I've already talked about, so whether a sound is voiced or not is when the vocal cords vibrate, and we've had aspiration, which is the puff of air, when you say p, t, k in English. And now let's look at what we actually call sounds. So we're starting with consonants. As I said, consonants include some kind of closure or restriction of the vocal tract. And Menea, now it would be useful if you switch to the camera, because the picture is going to stay the same for a while. So depending on where that closure happens, we can describe where in the vocal tract the closure happens. By the way, the vocal tract is everything humans use to make phonemes, which goes from your Adam's apple down here all the way to your mouth and your nose. Your nose is part of your vocal tract. And yeah, depending on where we close it off to form a consonant, we can denote the consonants by that. So we start at the front. You have your lips. This is the first bit. And because this is all Latin, because somebody needed to show off the classical education, we're not calling them lip consonant, we're calling them labial. Everything that involves these is labial. Next part is the teeth, typically the upper ones. So that's dental. If you put your teeth, your upper teeth to your lower lips, in Klingon, you get labio-dental, right? Labio and dental. Now, from now on, it's going to be a bit harder to show. So I want you all to take your tongue, not out of your mouth, leave it in there, and put it to the back of your upper teeth. If you put your tongue there and you pronounce something, that is a dental consonant. And now we're going to slowly drag our tongue back along the roof of our mouth. So first of all, what you're going to feel is a bit of a flat part, and then you're getting to a few little ridges. If you don't feel them very clearly in the middle, try moving to the side. Behind your canine teeth, they're usually more pronounced. It should be, if you're fully grown, typically only 2 or 3. These are called the alveolar ridges. And every consonant that is pronounced with the tongue against the alveolar ridges is called an alveolar consonant. Right. If you drag your tongue over them and behind them, the roof of your mouth is going to go up. Anything you pronounce along that slope, we get a lot of words. We get post-alveolar, palato-alveolar, pre-palatal, and alveolo-palatal. Going to depend a bit on sources how much these 4 terms are distinguished or how much they may be used interchangeably. But eventually you get to a dome-shaped hard part. That is your palate or hard palate. And anything you pronounce there is palatal. Now, if you've been doing this with the tip of your tongue is now bent back, approximately like this. Again, we go to Latin, back, retro, bend, flex, retro, flex. Any consonant that's pronounced with the tongue in that shape is a retroflex consonant, which we have in Klingon and die and shy, but which you may have heard in Indian languages or when in Indian English. They use that a lot. Now, I highly suggest that if you've been doing this with the tip of your tongue, you switch to the back of your tongue or it's going to start hurting. So if you put the back of your tongue to your hard palate and keep dragging it back, you will reach a softer part. That is your soft palate, also called velum. Any consonant you pronounce there is vela. And now you probably need to stop unless you've got zero gag reflex. But if you ever looked into somebody else's mouth, you know there is a teardrop-shaped thing hanging at the back. This thing marked with a 7 on the picture. That is your uvula. And any consonant you pronounce there is called uvula. Now you probably really need to stop using your tongue. If you go to the exact back of the mouth, here that is your pharynx. Any consonant pronounced there is pharyngeal. But we don't have that in Klingon, so we can skip it. If you go down into your neck, again, don't do it with your tongue, you have a, what is it actually? I actually don't know what it is biologically, but you have something that can close there. That's your glottis. And anything you pronounce there is glottal. Most important thing there is the Klingon glottal stop. Okay, I'm exaggerating it. But if you've ever spoken to somebody from London who speaks heavy Cockney, the way they say wa-a, bo-o, button, that is that sound. It's pronounced by the closure of the glottis somewhere. Adam's apple is here, so it's just above. Okay, so now the first thing we always do for a consonant is we describe where in the mouth it's pronounced. The next thing is how it is pronounced. So I already said we can just close off the flow of air. That would be a stop or plosive consonant. So b, d, p, k, t, and in Klingon. Those are your stops or plosives, where you completely interrupt the airflow. If you then release it again, that's called a released stop or released plosive. In Klingon, you generally do that. In English, in some cases, you may actually not. Now, if you don't fully close it, you leave a little bit through which to force the air to a point that the airstream goes turbulent. So something like this. You can hear the heavy hissing there. That's the turbulent airflow. And that is called a fricative. Klingon, we have 4 of these: r, ch, sh, and v. And when you leave a slightly, leave a slightly larger gap, so the airflow just doesn't become turbulent. It's an approximant. Oh, I'm sorry, there's a typo here. Approximant with an A here. So that's more. So you hear a little disturbance in the airflow, right? If there were 0 disturbance, it would be a vowel. But it's far, far less. And these are often thought of as fairly weak consonants and are sometimes hard to hear. So in Klingon, we have L, L, because at the sides of your tongue approach the top of your mouth. W, which is your 2 lips approaching, and Y, which is your tongue approaching the roof of your mouth, or approximating. That's why it's an approximant. Now you can combine these. If you have a stop and you release it not to nothing, but into a fricative or approximant, that's called an affricate. 4 of them in Klingon: ch, which is t and sh, ch; j, which is d and j, j; k, which is k and ch, gives k and t, which is t and t and l, gives you t. And there you have a subcategory of fricative and affricate, the sibilant fricatives and affricates, you pronounce them with a grooved tongue so that that turbulent airflow gets channeled into a particular small channel. And these generally, they give you a bit of a hissing sound. So s is the most obvious sibilant fricative. You have 3 in Klingon: ch, j, and sh. But yeah, they're a subcategory. Next we have trill, where some articulator, oh sorry, I forgot to say that, an articulator is any part of the vocal tract that moves. So your most important ones are your lips, your tongue, your velum and uvula can move slightly, and your glottis can, and of course your entire lower jaw. So if I vibrate any of them, that's a trill. The one that you've probably all heard is the so-called rolled R. So it's my tongue vibrating really fast. But if you've studied German or you know German, you may know that if you vibrate it at the uvula, sorry, I can do this. Now that was it. That's also a version of the R in German. And you can do it with your lips, which I don't always manage. Yeah, can't do it, but can only do it in bursts right now. But that would be a bilabial trill. 2 lips trill. Right, not everybody can pronounce this r sound, which you really need in Klingon. So just like Chatna said yesterday, your option is to just tap the tongue against the roof of your mouth once lightly. R, r, r. I agree with her. It's very similar to what Americans do for a T in certain positions like water or pity or city, etc. And that's called a tap or a flap. Some linguists do distinguish these 2 words, but most don't. And then you got the nasal, where the mouth is closed off in some way and all the airflow gets redirected to the nose. So that's mm. So you see, when I say M, my mouth is closed. Mm. And still you can hear the sound. Same for mm, where it's the tongue that closes it off behind the teeth, and mm, where the back of the tongue closes the mouth off quite far at the back. So those are your nasals. And oh yeah, that was it. Another option, Minaya, now you could switch back to the presentation. I think the picture here is more clear than what I can show on my own tongue. You can describe consonants by which part of the tongue is used, and sometimes that is necessary, and sometimes it's useful to be more detailed. Now, first distinction is, does something go out straight or to the sides? So, let's go with the sound S. If you, again, put a hand in front of your mouth and say a really forceful S, you should feel the air coming right in the front of your mouth. Now try the same thing with an L. There's nothing here, but put your hands to the sides. You might need some real force to feel it. But yeah, it goes out to the side. So that's the distinction between central and lateral. Then we distinguish by which part of the tongue we use. So tip of the tongue is apical, and below the tip of the tongue, the underside is subapical. Anything that uses the blade of the tongue is lamina, and if you know some Latin, you know that that is actually related to the Latin word for blade. My productive Latin is shit, but it's lame in French. And then the very back of your tongue, that for example you use to say the sound K in English, that's your dorsum. So anything you pronounce there is dorsal. Right, and anything you pronounce to the front is also called coronal. That's a really unattached, movable part of your tongue. Okay, and if we put all of this together, we get to this. You may have seen something like this before. This is a consonant chart, or really two of them. So one sorts by position in the mouth. So we have the labial consonants, p, b, v, m, w, the alveolar ones. And here you see plain or central, you can use both. T, n, r are the ones that go forward, but l and pl go sideways. So there you see this distinction, why we make this distinction of central versus lateral. And so on. And here's an alternative one which uses where on the tongue you pronounce it. So first of all, we have labial, which doesn't involve the tongue. Then we have coronal, so the front unattached part of the tongue, which again is subdivided into central and lateral. Then we have dorsal, the back part of the tongue. And glottal, which is down here, which again doesn't involve the tongue unless you're doing something very seriously wrong. Yeah, and now you should be able to at least mostly read that. Again, don't worry if you don't remember it after hearing it once. This is things, this sort of memorization, and in the end, it's nothing else. You're learning, this is the same as learning vocabulary. You're learning shit by heart. If it's, you know, if it's just going to take a while. But now at least when you hear, oh, Klingon has a voiceless alveolar lateral fricative, you should say, ah, I can construct what that means, or I have at least heard this before. And this, by the way, is the sound. So it's voiceless. This doesn't move my vocal cords at all. It's alveolar because my tongue touches the roof of my mouth at the alveolar ridges. It's affricate because I start with a plosive and release into an approximant, to l. And it's lateral because I release it sideways. Okay, that's consonants. Vowels is both a bit easier and a bit harder. So with vowels, we don't have a closure of the vocal tract, and we're trying to describe the form of the mouth. Shatna already did something there yesterday, so I'm going to be a bit shorter here. And again, I mostly want to introduce the words we use. So generally, we use up to 5 qualities to describe a vowel. The first is either openness or vowel height. So generally these days we prefer openness, which tells you how far your mouth is open. So generally in a vowel, you move your tongue up or down, which is also why we call it vowel height. A high vowel is typically one where your tongue is far up in your mouth, whereas a low vowel, it's lowered. I've read in some sources that Americans still use vowel height over openness. That may be the case. You'll hear both. The nice thing about vowel height is that it's kind of instinctive. If I ask you of the vowels E and O, which one is the high and which one is the low vowel, I'm willing to bet that you're all instinctively going to get it right and tell me that E is a high vowel and O is a low vowel. And then we get backness. That's basically how far back your tongue moves. So here are the 4 most important front vowels. So E is the most front, then E, A, all a bit further back. But for the real back vowels, you kind of squish your tongue and really far down and into the back of your mouth, like oo and O. Those are the full back vowels. And then roundedness, we had that yesterday. Unrounded lips, rounded lips. So E, nothing in my mouth changes. The only thing I'm changing is the shape of my lips, going from wide open Joker grin to fish mouth. E, backward 3. Oh, this green one here. That is an epsilon, and that is the IPA for the E sound, as in get, or the Klingon E. The next thing we have is length. That's fairly obvious how long is the vowel. Is it a or a? This is important in some languages. For example, in Japanese, a shujin is a landlord or the owner of a shop. A shujin is a prisoner. So shujin, shujin. The only difference is the length of that first vowel, and that makes a huge difference. And nasal, so we had nasal consonants, nasal vowels are similar. Only you don't fully close off your mouth, but you redirect part of the airflow through the nose. We don't have to care about this much. It doesn't exist in Klingon. Just like vowel length, Klingon only has short vowels. And that gets us a vowel chart. So again, I can probably go fast because Chatna showed this yesterday. This is a more chart-like one. Interesting thing here is that I would argue that the way it's been described, the IY diphthong in Klingon is really more of a digraph, because everything we've seen and heard it's the E sound. That doesn't change at all. So in my opinion, this is a monophthong. But here we get to something that may very well be controversial, because Chatna yesterday described it as a very slight diphthong. So 2 vowels. And yeah, again, we can see the movement here. So EI versus EU. We see how it changes. And the basic idea of this diagram is to try and map how the mouth is shaped. This one is really not an exact thing. So I've put the vowels in fairly extreme. If you look into people trying to really describe a language in detail, you'll get slight differences where exactly they put the individual sounds. So if you look up vowel chart on Wikipedia, for example, in the English Wikipedia, you get a list of 3 or 4 describing vowels in different dialects of English. And the exact position of these vowel dots will always change. Okay, a few sound processes. Those aren't super important for Klingon at first, but you may still hear them talked about, particularly because they don't exist. So first is assimilation. That's when a phoneme changes in contact with another phoneme. So a sound, I don't really have a good English example, so I'm giving you one from Swedish. Swedish rolls the R, r, and it does so with the tongue pulled back a bit. So if you have that sound and then immediately afterwards you're supposed to go to a sound that is pronounced with the tongue forward, that's difficult. So what Swedish does instead is that all those dental and alveolar consonants after an R are changed to retroflex. So the word for north, spelled N-O-R-D, is not Nord, because that's hard to pronounce, but it's Nord. So maybe you can hear the difference. Nord, Nord. One of them ends in a normal D and the other in a retroflex D. That is a case of assimilation. Mark Okrand has once said that if he had known people would learn Klingon, he would have invented assimilation rules, because this may make you think of words like kash, tach, vish, which are exceedingly difficult to pronounce because you need to move your tongue from being bent back for that shy sound to being pushed forward to the T sound. So it would be far easier to say kash, tach, vish with a retroflex T, or to cheat and say kash, tach, vish with an English sh. This is a common beginner's fault, particularly since a lot of English native-speaking beginners struggle with the retroflex S anyway. Try and be aware of it. It's difficult to say, so say it more slowly. I noticed this when we were recording Cool Talk Hwo. I don't know how many lines I re-recorded because I heard myself say kash, tach, vish with that retroflex T that has no business of being there. So I would sit there and practice kash, tach, vish, until my tongue stopped complaining. You may remember my earlier example of hamster. That's what's happening here as well. This is a form of assimilation because that releasing the M into an S without doing it very suddenly, which will give you this puff of air, this sudden release that makes it sound like a P, is actually harder than just putting that extra P in. So hamster is a form of assimilation. Another one is try and say 10 handbags very, very fast. 10 handbag. Was it? No, wait. 10. No, handbag was one example. And a lot of you will end up saying handbag. And the other one was, 10 books. 10 books, 10 books, 10 books. Say it 3 times really fast. And I'm almost willing to bet the last one will end up as 10 books. So assimilation can go over word boundaries as well. But yeah, the important thing for Klingon is don't say kashtachvish, say kashtachvish. Another one is rhoticity. That's actually a very English concept because in English you have your 2 best known, most widely spread dialects that differ there. So a rhotic dialect in English is one that pronounces all the R's. So we've had the example of water, which Americans pronounce water. So you have that final R, whereas people speaking received pronunciation in England say water. There's no R there. There's absolutely no trace of that R sound, water. It's just an R. But you get rhotic dialect in Britain as well. So again, I've lived in Scotland, water. That is a different R than in America, but it's still pronounced, so it's rhotic. So if this is a category you think in, then remember Klingon is rhotic. The R's are always pronounced, maybe particularly important when you're an English speaker and you're tempted to pronounce care as care, ka, or something like that. And finally, we have gemination or consonant lengthening. This is basically what it says on the tin. A consonant is pronounced longer. This is very important, for example, in a lot of Afro-Asiatic languages. So you find it in Hebrew, you find it in Arabic, you find it in Egyptian. You found it in the past. It is used by some Klingonists in words where 2 of the same consonant come together. So I have the example qet'ach here. I can either pronounce both of these T's clearly and say qet'ach, or I can lengthen the T and say qet'ach. Something I quite often do. Again, I bring up kulturkwo. Juliana asked me not to because she was of the opinion it's a bit less clear. And particularly for beginners, she's probably right. Note, however, in English, you don't actually do that. If you have a double consonant in English, what that means is that the preceding vowel is short. But you don't actually lengthen the consonant. There are really languages that do this consonant lengthening. Italian is another one, particularly the southern dialects. So I need a word. Cat in Italian is G-A-T-T-O. If you hear a northern speaker, it may just be gatto. But a southern speaker will really say gatto. You can really feel or hear how there is almost an interruption before the T is released. So that's called gemination. That's like Gemini, twins, the twinning of the vowel of the consonant or consonant lengthening. And with that, we're through section 1 of 5, and I've used up my hour. So next time we'll continue with morphology. I think this was actually the longest section because I really wanted to take some time to explain this thing about locations in the mouth. Yes, and I will find a place to ask where people would want a continuation. I'm in Europe, so expect something in the European evening. And we'll find a way, otherwise it will all be on YouTube, I can promise that much at least. And yeah, thank you for your attention. For the time being, are there any questions? Yes, go ahead. I mean, the next point is the online qep'a array, I think. Let me double check. Oh no, the next point is group photo. So we have a few minutes actually. All good. Do ask. No, the combination of the two is the only consonant cluster. Yes, exactly. This is particularly why it's so useful in Klingon to think of it as semi-vowels, because we write them as consonants, even though we pronounce them as vowels. Now, if you think about it, if you try and pay attention to what your tongue does when you pronounce E as in seen and Y as in yacht, Y, Y, my tongue moves millimeters at most. So these are already really closely related. It's probably why Mark chose to represent the diphthong that way. But yeah, because we write it with a consonant, it's kind of useful to think of that sound in a diphthong as a semi-vowel. You're welcome. Yes, lamina. Lamina consonants are the thought. There, my finger doesn't taste nice. Okay. Okay. I'm very happy, particularly since it was your idea. So I'm glad you found it helpful. Anybody else have any questions on this? That looks like a resounding no. So take some 10 minutes to put on your qep'a best, however you want to be on the group photo, and clear your head, because I know I threw a lot of words at you. Oh gosh, the chat is full. When may we finish it? I will put a poll somewhere where it's visible. I'll ask Core how long the qep'a channels stay open, because then I'll keep it to the qep'a channel, and we'll try and find a date when as many people as possible can participate. But again, Menaya has been recording this. I have permission to upload to the KLI YouTube channel, so that's where it will all end up. So even if you miss it, and seeing how long this took, there may be a part 3, if you'll bear with me. Let's see how far is this actually in terms of slides. Yeah, we're at slide 50 of 170 something. So yeah, I think I might need 3 parts. I'm sorry. This was supposed to be an introduction, but apparently I'm as good as that as I was in school at writing short summaries. Okay, well, if you think of it that way, then I'm happy to do as many parts as it takes. Yeah, I think we all need to win the lottery. Core normally keeps it live for at least a few weeks. Okay, then we'll expect it in chatting, or if I have the permission, and announce. No, then expect it in chatting, in the chatting channel. Okay, last chance for questions. All right, I take that as a no. Then I wish you good time at the rest of the qep'a.